Okay, welcome everyone to HEC Montreal's Chair in Energy Sector Management webinar series. I'm Joanne Whitmore, Senior Researcher at the Chair. So today we're going to be presenting a comparison of American and Canadian models that are used to perform life cycle assessments of GHG emissions from diesel and natural gas fuels used in freight transportation. So as many of you know, freight transportation is one of the most difficult sector to decarbonize due to its significant growth in the last 20 years and its dependence on fossil fuels. Alternative fuels such as natural gas has been viewed as a possibility to lower GHG emissions in the sector. However, the estimated amount of greenhouse gas reduction can vary based on how much reduction how the reduction is assessed, whether, for instance, you look at the point source or from well to wheel emissions, as well on which assumptions are factored into the analysis. So both Canada and the US currently use different models for assessing GHGs from fuels and vehicle technologies, despite having very integrated oil and gas markets. And the model GREET is often used in the US, while GHGenius is often used by Canada, notably Natural Resources Canada. So this webinar will be presenting an overview of both models, as well as the key assumptions and some limitations when performing LCA simulations in the freight sector. And just to provide a quick context, I just wanted to show a slide which definitely can show that the markets, the energy markets in Quebec are very well integrated when you look at the networks of pipelines for oil and natural gas. It doesn't end at the border. There's a lot flowing in and out from both countries and into the countries. So this is certainly relevant to look at both these models and see how they assume different parameters for that. And specifically in the context of Quebec, compared to the west of Canada, we have a particular situation. As you can see, our oil supplies for much of the time until the recent last 5 years was actually coming from outside of Canada in the US. And since 2014, as you can see, the last two rows, Canada and sources of oil from Canada and the US have been dominating. We have today about 41% of our oil coming from US and 36% from Canada. So that's a significant shift in the oil supplies. And for natural gas, before we used to have quite a lot of our gas coming from Alberta, but with the shale boom, as you can see, we have about now over 89%, at least for the largest distributor of natural gas in Quebec, that is coming through Dawn. And the extent, we don't have the same level of data as the oil, but what the studies are showing is that there's certainly likely a very large amount coming from the Marseilles region of shale gas. So faced with these things, how do the models evolve? How do we take in considerations the GHG throughout the life cycle? This is why I've invited two wonderful guests. First, we have Don O'Connor, who is president of S&T Square Consultants. He's the developer of the GHGenius model, which is widely used in Canada and the US and other countries. Don's a mechanical engineer with over 35 years of consulting, manufacturing, and marketing experience. He's also provided strategic advice on fuels and transportation issues to federal and provincial governments, as well as for a number of companies developing new technologies for alternative fuel vehicles and new transportation fuel processes. Our second guest is Andrew Burnham. Andrew is a principal environmental scientist at Argonne National Laboratory, where he's developed tools and provided technical analysis regarding the environmental and economic impacts of alternative fuels and advanced vehicles for the Department of Energy's Clean Cities program. He's been with the laboratory for close to 14 years, and he's performed life cycle analysis to help update the greenhouse gas regulated emissions and energy use transportation model, so the GREET model. He's an environmental engineer and also has a science degree in transportation technology and policy from UC Davis. And he's published quite extensively on life cycle analysis from various fuels. So we'll start with Dawn's presentation, followed by Andrew's. Each will have a presentation that will last about 20 minutes, and then we'll have a 20-minute period to take questions. The participants can send in their questions at any time during the presentation by typing them into the GoToWebinar platform. And at the end, when Andrew will finish his presentation, I will read from the list of questions, and both panelists can then answer the question. So the floor is yours. Dawn, I'm just going to unmute you and give you the control so that you can present. So there you go, Dawn. You should be able to talk and present.
Okay, thank you, Joanne. Can you see my screen?
Yep, you can.
Okay. So, first of all, a little bit of background in terms of what life cycle assessment is. So it's a technique for assessing the potential environmental aspects associated with a product or a service by compiling an inventory of the relevant inputs and outputs, evaluating the potential environmental impacts associated with those inputs and outputs, and interpreting the results of the inventory and impact phases in relation to the objective of the study. So this particular definition came from the US EPA. There are other very similar definitions from other groups, and I've bolded three of the words there: compiling, evaluating, and interpreting, because it's an action-oriented kind of exercise that one goes through. The life cycle assessment results are geographically and temporally specific. So that means that the numbers that one might get in Quebec for 2018 are different than the numbers you might have got in Quebec in 2010, and they are different from what you would find in Ontario or British Columbia or the United States. And some of the easy ways to think about this is that, the carbon intensity of power production in Quebec is very different than it is in the US. Quebec's almost 100% hydro, whereas US has got an awful lot of thermal power production from coal or gas. Quebec oil refineries process different crude oil slates than most regions of the US and have different product slates. So the ratio of gasoline to diesel differs. And while the North American market might be integrated from a crude oil perspective, there are different classes of crude oil, and not all refineries can process all the different kinds of crude oil. So there are some variation. And then technology is always changing. And the rates of change are usually faster with new technologies than they are with old technologies. But whatever we do to come up with data today, by the time we get to 2025, it's probably not relevant. So a little bit about GHGenius. It was first developed in 1999 by S&T Squared Consultants and Levelton Consultants. Between 2003 and 2013, the development was mostly funded by Natural Resources Canada, and the model was made publicly available. Since 2014, S&T Squared Consultants have continued to develop the model, but the current version of the model is not yet available to the public. The new model has over 100 updates to pathways, so new pathways, data updated, many new features and functionality with the model. So when I give some results today, that will be out of GHGenius 5.0, which is not currently in the public domain. The public version of the model is currently referenced in regulations in BC, Ontario, and Alberta with respect to fuel, so renewable fuels or low carbon fuels. It's widely used in academia, the private and public sectors in Canada, and in other parts of the world. It's the only public LCA model with Canadian data. But it also has data for the US, for Mexico and India, and the new version has regional European data in it as well. So where does the data come from? Almost all the data in the model is from public data sources. So sources like Statistics Canada, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, some of the provincial regulators make information available. And then when we look at other regions, the US, there is information from the US EPA and the Department of Energy's Energy Information Administration. There's a lot of information in these models, so GHGenius 5.0 has over 350,000 cells with either input or output data from the model. A lot of the data in GHGenius is regionalized, so that the model can be run for a province, a region, so we divide Canada into West, Central, and East, or a country, in the case of looking at, the Mexico or India or one of the European countries. One of the things that makes GHGenius a little bit different is the model uses time series of data to account for year-to-year variability and to extrapolate to future years. And some of the time series are actually almost 80 years worth of data in the model. So the nice thing about time series is that it does sort of automatically continually to update the model, even if you don't change the model, just by changing the year that you run it for. And when we get into particularly biological systems where the results for any given year can be influenced by the weather, using time series to smooth that out is a more appropriate use of data rather than a specific 6-month snapshot that might depend on the weather. So when we look at the two fuels that are the subject of the webinar, diesel fuel, in GHGenius, the refining data is regionalized. So we combine data for Ontario and Quebec into the Central Canada region, primarily because Stats Canada, for confidentiality reasons, doesn't provide all of the information on a provincial basis. One of the challenges is that since 2013, StatsCan data has been heavily redacted for a lot of the petroleum sector data. And so a lot of work on the data needs to be done because some particular months of the information might not be available. And you need to do some interpolation to try to get a full data set for a year. One of the advantages of regionalizing it is the petroleum sector actually considers Ontario and Quebec to be a single supply region. So product does move back and forth between the two provinces due to refinery upsets or changes in demand. The refineries in Quebec and Ontario process mostly light sweet crude oil with a little bit of synthetic oil in some of the Ontario refineries, but very little bitumen or other heavy oils. Most of the heavy oil produced in Canada is actually exported to the United States. Quebec refineries process about a third Canadian, a third US, and a third imported oil. But as Joanne mentioned and showed in her slide, that can vary significantly from one year to the next, depending on pricing. Within GHGenius, each oil producing region, and there's about 20 or 25 around the world, has its own crude oil GHG emissions associated with that particular country, which reflects the production practices in that region, plus the transportation emissions to Quebec. And so when we look at GHGenius and refining emissions across Canada, we do see some differences from region to region. So here are diesel fuel delivered to the vehicle when we run the model for Quebec, about 20,700 grams of CO2 per gigajoule based on a higher heating value basis. And in GHGenius, the data is all broken out by the specific stages of the life cycle. So a couple of the numbers here: feedstock upgrading, a value there indicates there is some synthetic oil that's produced in the refinery, and the other clue to that is emissions displaced co-products. So that also comes from the fact that some synthetic oil is refined in this supply orbit. Looking at natural gas in Quebec is a mixture of Western Canadian gas and US gas. The information that Joanne showed earlier, there is Canadian gas supply that goes into Dawn. So just because most of the gas comes from Dawn, it doesn't necessarily tell us that it is US gas. The blends can change due to pricing, but I think that for the last few years, from the available information available from Stats Canada and from the National Energy Board, there's about a 50-50 split between Canadian gas and US gas in this supply region. The US emission data in GHGenius for natural gas comes mostly from the US National Inventory Report. The Canadian gas data is from a number of sources. So the Alberta Energy Regulator produces monthly data on the gas sector. The National Energy Board, Statistics Canada, and we have some information on the transmission and distribution sectors that comes from the annual emission reports provided by the T&D sector, and every 2 or 3 years they have their emission values third-party audited. Canadian gas in the model is actually a blend of conventional gas, associated gas, coal-bed methane, shale, and tight gas. And we have a little bit of differentiated information on the production systems for each of those different sources of gas. And time series of data is used for both countries, so both the US EPA and all of the Canadian data sources are available on with annual data, although once again, Statistics Canada has changed what they report between prior to 2015 and since 2016. So the data that's in my version of the model is up to 2015 at this point in time. The available data suggests that gas production in Canada uses about 10% less energy than the US and has lower methane losses in production and processing. However, transmission distances in Canada are longer, but the pipeline energy intensity is a little bit lower these days. And one of the areas where there is some significant differences between Canada and the US is the types of engines that are used for gas compression on the transmission sector. So the US is about 50% reciprocating engines, and we have hardly any reciprocating engines in Canada. And reciprocating engines, these are piston engines that go up and down rather than gas turbines. They do have some significant methane slip in the engines. So we see higher methane combustion engines in T&D in the US than we do in Canada. So within GHGenius, when we look at the net impact of the carbon intensity of gas delivered to Quebec from Western Canada versus the US, it's a fairly small number in the overall life cycle emissions, and the longer transmission distances from Western Canada are offset by other differences in the supply chain. So here are compressed natural gas. So this is the GHG emissions for gas at 3,000 psi as it is delivered into a vehicle in Quebec. So we have the US gas supply in the first column, the Western Canada gas in the second column, and the blend of the two at 50-50 in the third column. So things like fuel dispensing and fuel distribution and storage, all of those activities happen within Quebec. So they're the same for all of the sources of gas. Down towards the bottom, CO2 removed from the natural gas. So one of the things that happens with the gas as it is extracted from the ground is that it has to be purified essentially to meet pipeline specifications. And the amount of CO2 removed from the US gas is a little bit higher than it is from Western Canadian gas at this point in time. Feedstock transmission, that's the pipeline distances, so you can see the higher emissions associated with the longer Canadian distance. So one of the other things that is a little more uncertain in terms of the natural gas is the vehicle fuel use. So natural gas can be used as liquid natural gas or as compressed natural gas in vehicles. Now, natural gas has a high octane rating, which means that it won't compression ignite and can't be used in a diesel engine without some modification. So the industry has used some different approaches for getting the engines to operate on natural gas. With CNG, it's used in diesel engine that's been modified for spark ignition. So the Cummins Westport engines are the dominant engine in this particular sector, and they have a spark plug. And that's what makes the engine work. So it is a diesel engine that has been modified to a little lower compression ratio than the diesel engine and a spark plug. LNG engines use some diesel fuel to initiate combustion, so that's how the natural gas gets ignited. Both engines are present in Quebec, but there are currently no new LNG engines for Canadian trucks right now. Volvo does have an LNG engine that they have introduced in some markets using the Westport technology, but it's not yet available in Canada. The LNG engines with the diesel fuel to ignite them offer almost the same energy efficiency as diesel engines. And in Quebec, the LNG is produced with electric drive and offers lower GHG emissions than some other LNG in other regions that use natural gas drive or regions with a high power carbon intensity. The spark-ignited engines are usually less efficient than the diesel engines, but because the brake-specific fuel consumption curves are very different between the diesel and the natural gas engines, the duty cycle can have an impact on the relative efficiency. And there have been a few reports of actually better energy efficiency on CNG than diesel for some duty cycles. So the information in the duty cycle in terms of real world information is a little sparse, and it makes it a bit of a challenge to predict what might happen in the future. Vehicle fuel use, methane slip from the engines is an important issue, and methane slip has been reduced in newer engines through changes to crankcase ventilation systems and changes to catalyst. So when we look at the exhaust emissions from CNG heavy-duty truck in GHGenius, and we run the model for a 20-year period, you can see that the emissions have gone down by 10% over that period. So the first change was really the introduction of catalysts on these vehicles, and then the more recent change is a combination of the crankcase ventilation and newer catalyst systems for these vehicles. So presenting some results here, diesel versus natural gas. So these are run for a Class 8 heavy-duty truck. They run for Quebec in the year 2018, and they use the 2007 100-year global warming potentials. So here we have results for the diesel in the first column, and LNG truck with the 5% diesel for ignition, and then the CNG truck. So we can see that the LNG in Quebec offers about a 25% reduction in GHG emissions over the fuel cycle, and so we get emission reductions in the vehicle operation because of the high efficiency and the fact that natural gas has a lower carbon content than diesel fuel. The emission savings with CNG are not as large, and you can see that the vehicle operation emissions have gone up 833 to 954, and so that is a function mostly of the lower efficiency of the natural gas in one of these modified diesel engines with spark ignition. So looking at the impact of global warming potentials, so the methane GWP has increased with the 2013 IPCC values, but these values are not currently used for reporting or regulatory purposes anywhere in Canada. IPCC also provides 20-year and 100-year GWPs, and the methane 20-year is much higher than the 100-year value due to the shorter life of methane in the atmosphere. And there are those who promote using the 20-year GWPs as more realistic. However, on the other hand, you can find lots of scientists who favor using the 100-year values because of the fact that things like CO2 last much longer in the environment. But within the new GHGenius, we have all of these different sets of GWPs in the model, and so it's really easy to see the impact on these. So here is the impact on looking at 3 different scenarios. The 2007 100-year GWPs, which is what I presented in the previous slide. And then if we look at increasing or changing the GWPs to the 2013 values, where natural gas has gone up by about 40%, we see that there is that the GWP is not quite as good. So it drops down to 14%. Now, one of the things to remember is that there are also methane losses in the fossil fuel crude oil system. And so when we run the model for 2013, 100-year GWPs, not only do the natural gas values go up, but the fossil diesel values go up as well. And then when we look at using the 20-year GWPs, so in this case, the methane has gone from 35 to about 85, so 2.5 times larger. Here we see much larger changes, and we're now down to a little less than a 5% reduction in GHG emissions compared to diesel fuel run with the same 20-year 2013 GWPs. So just some comments here. These results that I've shown are for Quebec only, and the results are different when we look at other provinces or other regions of the world. The results are obviously sensitive to methane leakage, and there remains some uncertainty in concern defining exactly what these methane leakage rates are. There's a great deal of difficulty in quantifying the values because the emissions are not necessarily continuous, so they're not uniform the whole year round. And there's between 400 and 500,000 gas wells in Canada, and measuring emissions at every one of them is just not practical. All the data does show that methane leakage rates are declining with time. We see that both in Canada and in the US. And there is also currently a lot of interest in renewable natural gas in Canada and elsewhere. And RNG would have much lower GHG emissions because we don't include the renewable carbon CO2 emissions in the final analysis. So that's the end of my slides. So Joanne, back to you.
Okay, thank you. So Andrew, I'm going to give you the presenter.
Well, thank you very much. And Don gave a great introduction to the topic. And so I'm going to highlight the GREET model, which is a US-based model, and talk about the greenhouse gas emissions for diesel and natural gas for freight transportation. So I'm going to give a little background, talk about some of our users, data sources, uncertainty, then talk about diesel vehicle greenhouse gas emissions, highlight some of the work we've done on oil sands, shale oil production, GHG analysis, as well as refineries, and then talk about natural gas vehicle greenhouse gas emissions, highlighting methane leakage, as well as vehicle fuel economy and renewable natural gas. The GREET model, which is the Greenhouse Gases Regulated Emissions and Energy Use in Transportation model, analyzes transportation and energy systems. So those include passenger vehicles, heavy-duty trucks and buses, airplanes, marine vessels, and power plants. And it looks at energy use, GHGs, air pollution, and water consumption. GREET is a free and public domain model, and it's updated and expanded annually. Here we see a visual kind of the well to pump versus the pump to wheels, which is kind of, some of the terminology, and Don already kind of highlighted a lot of that. One other thing that he didn't mention was that we do also analyze the vehicle cycle, which is basically to produce the vehicle. So comparing, say, a electric vehicle with a battery versus a gasoline vehicle with an engine. So Argonne System Assessment Group is about 30 researchers, and there's 3 different teams. There's a life cycle analysis team, a biofuels team, and a deployment analysis team. So everybody kind of works on different issues, but pretty much all of our work somehow, ultimately will get into GREET. So those who focus on biofuels do that. Others focus on electric vehicles. I've done some work on natural gas vehicles, and that's why I'm talking to you today. So the GREET model has been supported by the United States Department of Energy since 1995. Here are some of the offices that have supported it, including the Vehicle Technology Office, Bioenergy, Fuel Cells, Geothermal, and the Policy and Systems Analysis. And so GREET has been used by the Department of Energy and other federal agencies for R&D decisions, help them understand what the environmental implications of different fuels and vehicle technologies are. It's also been used by the United States EPA for their renewable fuel standard and vehicle greenhouse gas standard development. California took the original GREET model, developed their own version called California GREET for its low carbon fuel standard. And other groups such as the energy industry, auto industry, universities all use this to understand the implications of different fuels and vehicles. Currently, there's about 30,000 registered GREET users, and this is globally. Primarily, it's used in North America, but we see it used in other places as well. Typically, it's academia, education, people who are downloading the model, but we have lots of industry partners as well. So one of the things with GREET, it is a US-based model, so Don was highlighting kind of the Canadian case. So we are US focused, but there have been efforts to take the model and use it other places. So this, because the model is parametric and you have lots of inputs that you can change, you can adjust some things, the key assumptions to get a realistic result for your area. And so people have worked to do those things. So where does GREET data come from? And similar to GHGenius, we're using oftentimes data sources like the Energy Information Administration from the US. They do AEO projections. EPA has emissions data for electric systems. We're taking field operation data, so we've done some work on oil sands and shale operations, so we're getting actual data to analyze process efficiency, emission factors. Then we're also using simulations. So there's Aspen Plus, which helped us look at different types of fuel production. Argonne has an autonomy model, which does fuel economy simulations. And then we use EPA for some of their vehicle emissions and stationary emissions. And they use, those models are using data from various emission studies, emission factor analysis as well. We also collaborate with other national laboratories to do techno-economic analyses, and then we're often trying to work with industry to get the best data on different fuels, and then we're working with automakers for the vehicle side. So what are some of the main issues with life cycle analysis? Talk about a little bit of the limitations. So we need to have a system boundary, that's the scope, and that's an important part when you're trying to compare things apples to apples. GREET is a process-based LCA, so we're typically looking at a somewhat of a fixed system for the most part, and trying to understand what the inputs outputs of the process are to look at the emissions. Consequential LCA involves thinking about how changes to the system or changes that you might make will impact other systems. So one of those things that have been brought up often is biofuels, like what is the impact of land use change if you have a policy to produce a lot of biofuels for vehicles. So we do include some consequential LCA into the model as well. Co-products, that's an important part. So for oil and natural gas, we have to think about some of the co-products like NGL, natural gas liquids, and so forth. Think about their implications. Don highlighted this, that there are temporal variations. So depending on the time frame, vehicles, fuel production pathways, efficiencies change. Geographic and spatial variation, this is what we're talking about specifically today. How does Canada differ from the US? And then data uncertainty. So we don't know methane emissions exactly for the US or Canada. We're continually to work to try and improve the data around that, but it's an area that there's uncertainty. And so some of the limitations for life cycle analysis, or just even this in general, or GREET in general, is that we have current data and then we have an uncertain future. So we are trying to make best estimates of what things are going to happen in the future. Different technologies have different technology readiness levels, and so trying to compare, again, apples to apples for a technology that is in a demonstration phase and what it's going to be like when it's, you know, potentially fully market ready. And there's other issues outside of LCA when we're making choices about fuels, such as infrastructure availability. That's an important part for natural gas vehicles. Same thing with economics and market acceptance. All these things are somewhat outside of LCA and features that, you know, others have to analyze. So one of the things that we do to try to handle some of the uncertainty with the data is that we've designed some stochastic simulation to look at the variability of specific inputs. So we have, like GHGenius, hundreds of thousands of different data points. So, you know, you can look at some distribution for certain key factors and see how that will impact your results. Such as this, where you see, you know, some vehicles might have a pretty tight boundary, tight results boundary, and others might have much wider because of uncertainty. So now I'm going to highlight some issues relating around diesel vehicle greenhouse gas emissions. So the system boundary that we're looking at in GREET is including exploration and recovery of crude oil, the transportation of that crude, refining, then transporting it to a refueling station, then finally combustion in a vehicle. So we've done work recently on looking at Canadian oil sands. We've examined all 27 major projects since 2008 to update the 4 major different pathways. And so we're comparing really the oil sands versus conventional crudes. And what this shows is that we do see, you know, oil sands having much more carbon intensive production than US conventional crudes. And so that can be up to 3 to 6. I think on average, the weighted average is about 4 times as much. But to keep into mind that this is only well to refinery. So this is just kind of this recovery phase of the portion. So I'm gonna work towards this total life cycle so we can see how much it, you know, potentially will matter. But we see something like 6 versus 26 for conventional versus oil sands in grams of CO2 per megajoule. We recently did some work analyzing both Argonne and Eagle Ford shale oil. And what we found here is that actually these sources of crude are much lower intensity than, say, oil sands. So very similar to conventional crudes, really. From Bakken, which is in North Dakota, we see the emissions being slightly higher, and then those in Eagle Ford, which is in Texas, being pretty much the same as conventional crudes. A major effort that we've done is look at refinery analysis, and this is US specific, where we collected data from 43 large refineries, which represented about 70% of the US capacity. And through this, we were looking at developing linear programming modeling. And basically what we're trying to do is understand how much energy, where the inputs and outputs for different processes, so we can analyze and understand and better allocate, like, where the energy in a refinery is going to based on the product suite. So what we see here is that, you know, depending, looking at gasoline or diesel, there's quite a different range in the results, but, you know, it is pretty uncertain, or that there's, it really depends on the refinery as well. There's some uncertainty on basically how the refinery is designed. But when we take all these pieces together, the reality is that the well-to-wheel greenhouse gas emissions of petroleum fuels is by far dominated by end-use CO2 and basically your fuel efficiency. So the crude recovery portion, you know, it's relatively small. The refinery portion is, again, relatively small. It can change the results here and there, depending whether you're looking at, say, oil sands versus conventional. It's going to shift it a little bit, And that can be important when you're comparing to other fuels, but it's important to realize that, that especially when you get to vehicles and fuel efficiency, that end use CO2 is really crucially important. So now I'll talk about natural gas. So our system boundary is looking at very similar kind of ideas, looking at the recovery, natural gas production, either from conventional gas or shale gas, processing, transmission, compression and refueling for CNG, or we also have liquefaction for LNG, and then finally end use. So one of the areas that unmentioned is that methane leakage is of key uncertainty right now. And so some of the initial studies, say 5, 6 years, 7 years back, were showing some really significant leakage rates. Even EPA's inventory approach, which is kind of a bottom-up, looking at specific emission factors for different pieces of equipment, we're showing pretty high emissions. And then in red, you see this top-down approach, so doing more aerial, measuring the concentration of methane in the air, and then trying to apportion that to specific sources. And so those top-down studies were showing really significant leakage rates. And then within the last couple of years, we're seeing those emission assumptions or those emission estimates go down significantly, especially in the US. So before we're something like 2% leakage rate from the EPA, now we're closer to 1%. Still, that there is this differentiation between this top-down and bottom-up approach, and we're continually to narrow that gap, and even more recent studies have brought that into closer scrutiny, and I think we're getting closer to understanding what those numbers really are. So moving on to vehicle methane leakage, Don mentioned this previously, is that something that wasn't often talked about was crankcase methane slip. And we saw from the data from Cummins Westport as being the primary producer of these vehicles that crankcase emissions were 4 or 5 times higher than the tailpipe, which is what most people were testing. So the good thing with scrutiny on this, that Cummins Westport developed a closed crank ventilation system to reduce those emissions, and that's now standard in model year 2018 vehicles. So that's an important factor and something that's really is going to help the greenhouse gas emissions for these vehicles. Another factor is the relative fuel economy. And so this really depends on the engine technology. So Don was talking about spark ignition versus compression ignition engines, what kind of duty cycle it is. So here in this chart, we see a spark ignited natural gas in a highway, city, and then we see the compression ignition engine. So the stop and go, think about a transit bus application, and we see a larger penalty, both in the past and today for spark ignited. And then once you go to more highway freight applications, which is I think the interest of the people on this webinar, is that the penalty is a little bit less, and there's reasons we can talk about why that is. And then once you get to the compression ignition, you get even closer to diesel, but they oftentimes say it can be exactly the same. The actual data shows it's a little bit lower. But these are important factors that, as Don mentioned, the data is not great, and it's hard often to get real good apples to apples comparisons of this, but we are pretty confident that there is this differentiation between kind of stop and go versus highway driving. So here's a kind of bringing all these things into focus, is that there is uncertainty on methane leakage, and there is uncertainty on fuel economy, and these are really two of the key drivers for you're comparing a natural gas vehicle, say a freight truck, versus a diesel, and this is natural gas from a fossil source. So if we're looking at what GREET is currently, so the current generation of trucks, the pre-2018 trucks that didn't have closed crankcase ventilation, So adding up that upstream leakage of about 1% plus all the leakage at the station and then on the vehicle, we're up to around, say, 3% leakage rate. So to beat a diesel, you needed to have a fuel economy, something in the 15, between 15 and 10% penalty. So that's kind of in this area. So that's what we're showing, that you had to be better than that to be kind of better than, I guess, diesel. And so once we've gone to the near zero vehicles, you have a lot more leeway on the leakage rate. So you have more leeway, I guess, on the fuel economy, I should say, that any vehicle basically under 15% penalty is going to have improved greenhouse gas emissions. But the reality is the percentages that we're showing are relatively small, and it can flip directionally, that you can be a little bit better, you can be a little bit worse, depending on what the leakage rate is, depending on what the fuel economy assumption is. So once we think about renewable natural gas, we're seeing really significant reductions in emissions. So something, for 80%, even more than 100%, taking credit for capturing this methane that would go to the air otherwise. So this is an important part of the United States natural gas industry, specifically in California. They have some ability to develop credits for this, and they're estimating 50% of the natural gas use in California for transportation is renewable natural gas. The challenge is that the supply is limited. So, total natural gas consumption in the US was something like 24 quads in 2013. When we're looking at the potential production of renewable natural gas from landfill gas and some of these anaerobic digesters, we're talking about a half a quad a year. So that's the big challenge. So in summary, the GREET model was supported and developed through the US Department of Energy. It's open and transparent. The data is from different field data, open literature, and modeling, and it's updated annually. Diesel greenhouse gas emissions are dominated by end-use CO2. Oil sands can increase emissions, while shale oil are pretty similar. The greenhouse gas benefits of natural gas vehicles are heavily influenced by both fuel economy and methane leakage, and the relative fuel economy of natural gas vehicles are affected by duty cycle, engine technology, and design. And then with improvement in methane leakage and natural gas vehicle efficiency, NGVs can provide moderate greenhouse gas reductions using fossil natural gas. Renewable natural gas can provide large GHG benefits, but the supply is limited. So that's the end of my presentation. If we are passing along these slides, we have some links to some of the work that we've done in the last couple of years on these topics. Thank you.
So I was saying we can start taking questions, and wanted to thank both of you. These were extremely interesting and I think beneficial presentations. Maybe I have actually one question. I'll take the opportunity, given that I organized this, to ask one. Because what I'm seeing is that both these models are extremely important, sophisticated, but they seem to be also showing very different results. And currently, like I was saying in the intro, natural gas is very important or at least being considered very important as a policy option to reduce GHGs in the freight transport sector. And so I'm just wondering, given the differences of each of these models, but the reality that the energy markets in North America are quite integrated, would it be worth for policymakers to be able to somehow use both of the results coming from these different models as a way to sort of better inform decisions instead of perhaps often what we do is rely on one model?
So I'll take a stab at that. I mean, I've done some projects for various people looking at the comparison between models. So not only GREET and GHGenius, but some of the European models as well. I would say that on the natural gas systems, when you run GHGenius for the US, there are not very many differences at all between the results between GREET and GHGenius. And so if we're seeing differences in what's being presented here, we need to dive down and see, what stage of the life cycle the differences are coming from. And, I mean, there's a significant amount of electricity used for compressing the natural gas up to 3,000 or 3,500 psi, and we're going to get different emissions in Quebec than we get running the GREET model in the US for that particular stage. And when we're looking at differences of 15% plus or minus 5 percentage points, that's 10,000 grams so per gigajoule. So if we're going to have half of that, could very well be just the difference in electricity.
Right. So we're using U.S. average electricity mix versus what might be used for Quebec. So I think in general, it is good to try to understand, why things are different. And, I think I haven't looked at GHGenius to understand those differences. So it's good that Don, has that experience. But that is the ability of most of these models, that if, you get the data kind of in the same, format, and you use the same data, these are tools that allow you to kind of generate results, and that methodologically there's probably not huge differences. It's just making sure that you're using the same data sources and trying to answer the right question. And so yeah, GREET is not answering the question for Canada.
And the other thing that I would say is that we do cooperate. So when we find things in other people's models, we bring them to the attention of the other party. There was just a paper released a couple of weeks ago where the lead authors were folks at Argonne on the GREET that looked at the soybean biodiesel pathway, and I was also one of the authors on that. So I ended up supplying a lot of the industrial data to the GREET people so they could update their model.
Okay, thank you. I'll take some of the questions that are coming in. So one is, does GHGenius consider uncertainty part in the model like GREET?
So we do have a Monte Carlo tool that's built right into the model, so users can decide which variables that they want to look at and what the probability distribution function should be, and they can run the model for 10,000 times or something and generate their own distribution curve on the results.
Okay. Another question is, does GHGenius have the capability of calculating GHG emissions for renewable natural gas from various sources?
So the public version does have a couple of RNG pathways in it. So it's got landfill gas, it's got some anaerobic digestion pathways in it that are fairly flexible, but I think could probably be made better.
Okay. A follow-up question to that was, is it possible to calculate cradle to grave GHG emissions of the electric buses via GHGenius?
Yeah, Andrew mentioned the vehicle side of it. We do have the vehicle emissions in GHGenius as well. Now, the public version does not have an electric bus, but GHGenius 5.0 does have an electric bus in it.
Okay, so next question is, you mentioned that, oh, sorry, it just moved. You mentioned that the gas loose at the well is lower in Canada than the US, but in the following table, you showed zero emission associated with leak loss. Could you clarify how you consider CH4 diffused emissions in your GHGenius results, and why no leaks?
So gas leaks, so that's one of the changes that we've made in the new model is methane emissions used to be aggregated over the full life cycle and presented in a single line. But one of the changes, people were always asking for what was the emissions per individual stage. So we have now put the emissions, the methane emission losses as part of, buried in each individual stage. And then of course the model also gives you separate gases by stage. So we can get methane by stage for the model. But I haven't taken the gas leaks and flares out because we still do gas leaks and flares separately in the crude oil pathways.
Okay, well, another person had the same question, why are leaks and flames at zero? But you just answered that. How do results change by truck size? And I guess this is for perhaps both of you.
So obviously, as you change the size of the truck, when you're looking at the emissions per kilometer, takes a smaller truck doesn't use as much fuel, so the emissions per kilometer are lower for smaller trucks. We don't have differences of relative efficiencies between gas and diesel that vary by truck size in the model currently. So there's sort of there's a limit in terms of how much you can do there. I mean, if you looked at different diesel engines from the same manufacturer, you would find slightly different efficiencies by engine design.
Yeah.
So yeah, we in one of our more recent updates, we added heavy duty vehicles to GREET, and that was for the longest it was a light duty focus model. And with that, we tried to look at some key vehicle applications from medium duty to heavy duty, so including refuse trucks, transit buses, school buses, freight trucks, whether they're combination or single unit, so on. So I think one of the key things is it's as Don mentioned, obviously as the vehicle gets bigger, it's probably going to use more fuel, but when you're trying to do comparisons, it's really about the relative fuel economy. So I presented the one slide about whether you're kind of doing a stop and go versus a highway cycle, and we found that for spark ignited engines and this is not just natural gas, but just in general spark ignited engines, their efficiency suffers in stop and go applications. This has to do with throttling losses and also at idle, just the differences between a diesel engine versus a compression ignition versus spark ignited. So that's how we kind of differentiate, and so you can look at it like that. So really it's more duty cycle than the size.
Okay. Another question is, do the models provide estimates of expected changes in efficiencies of trucks?
So for GREET, yes, in our heavy duty analysis, we looked at past fuel economy. Unfortunately, the US had a census. Unfortunately, the census stopped, and we have our data on understanding different types of vehicle types is somewhat limited, but we're using kind of overall projections of freight trucks, and since there's a little dip in 2010 due to some of the NOx regulations, but due to the heavy duty regulations in the US, they're pushing those up. So whether you choose 2015 or 2020, we're incorporating what the estimates are for fuel economy for that year.
Don, did you have something to add?
So You know, the model gives, so we do have some projections built into the model, and we also have the historical. So, you know, if you're using diesel fuel as part of one of your life cycles, we take data from Natural Resources Canada, the Comprehensive Energy Use Database, where they have fuel economy for different transportation applications, and so all of that is built into the model. And we have some on the light duty side. The change in fuel economy due to engine efficiencies on the heavy duty side is more difficult to project and less significant in the overall scheme of things.
Okay, one of the last questions is it's off topic, but it says, can you talk about tailpipe emissions of biofuels, NOx, SOx? Do we have good estimates for both of these?
Well, I mean, that's one of we focus here on GHG emissions, but of course, the natural gas vehicles tend to have much lower particulate and some lower NOx emissions than diesel engines as well. So, you know, there's reasons for looking at natural gas in the heavy-duty transport sector other than just GHG emissions. Looking at biofuels, I think that most so biofuels have to meet the same sulfur requirements as gasoline, so there's not going to be any SOx impacts. On the diesel side, you know, the sulfur level in diesel fuel, on-road diesel fuel, is also very low, so we don't see any real differences in SOx. There is some controversy on biodiesel with respect to what its NOx impact might be. And again, you know, we probably don't have as much information as we need, but there's also indications that the new diesel engines, there is no impact. And on the gasoline side of things, you know, hydrocarbons and CO tend to be lower with ethanol gasoline blends, but all new cars are so much lower than they were 10 or 15 years ago that while the percentage reduction might be the same as what it was 10 years ago, the absolute reduction is pretty small.
So we developed, again, this GREET heavy-duty model, and we analyzed the latest data on air pollutant emissions as well. So we spent a lot of time, and I'm not sure if my screen is still showing, but this is this 2015 report. For biofuels, I think there was a long controversy on whether the NOx go up or down. There is limited data, but what data is available shows that once we got to vehicles needing selective catalytic reduction, that fuel effects don't matter anymore, that, you know, it's not impacting emissions like it was potentially before you had SCR. So, but yeah, we've done some significant analysis of natural gas specifically. I work with Clean Cities, which is the deployment arm of Department of Energy, and they're very interested in that. And so I spent a lot of time trying to understand the NOx implications of heavy-duty trucks for the VW mitigation funding, as well as PM. So NOx, definitely, there's engines developed specifically that have low NOx. California has an optional standard on that, and natural gas was the first to meet those really low, ultra-low NOx engines. PM, because of the particulate filters, we don't see much difference between natural gas and diesel for PM emissions. You know, the filters cause some operational issues, but the actual emissions, we're not seeing a big difference. So you can look at that report or contact me for more details on air pollutants, because that's one of the areas that I focus on.
Okay, thanks. There's a couple of others that just came in. One is, do both models, does GHGenius have regional differences for planned changes in power grid?
Yes. So we use the National Energy Board forecast, which they update every couple of years. So the public version is probably based on a 2011 forecast. The new version is based on forecasts that came out last fall.
Okay. And one, can each model simulate a specific life of vehicle hours of operation, vehicle miles traveled, example, various driving cycles, highway duty cycle, there's some long questions here, refuse drive cycle, transit drive cycle, based on actual measured real-world driving CO2 measurements?
I can, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Andy. You can.
So, no, I mean, what you would want there is typically, you know, I'll just speak for GREET, is that we're taking fuel economy data in some aggregate form to get our numbers, and same thing for emissions, we're using EPA's moves, and that's based on some kind of average vehicle average drive cycle. For all these, I guess, efforts, that if you had very specific fuel efficiency data, very specific emission factors for a diesel truck, you could enter them, or you had something for diesel and the natural gas, you can adjust to compare. But no, the model isn't like a vehicle simulation model. We rely on autonomy. It's an Argonne model that does vehicle simulations for trying to look at, you know, how does a gasoline versus a plug-in hybrid versus a battery electric vehicle differ based on, you know, some drive cycle or real-world driving. Is kind of how we do it. So you'd have to kind of do something like that and then enter it into a model like GREET or probably GHGenius as well.
Yeah, I mean, lifecycle models have some sort of functional unit. So, you know, within both of these models, you can get emissions per unit of energy, you can get emissions per distance traveled, but they're always, you know, per some comparable unit. So, you know, these models do not roll up emissions to an annual basis or so much other factor. You would have to do that sort of roll up outside of the models.
I developed something for Clean Cities called the A-Fleet tool. The A-Fleet tool was developed for fleet managers to use really the average data from GREET, basically for the greenhouse gas emissions, same thing, air pollutants. You can enter your fuel economy, enter your miles traveled, and then it has some cost data, so you can do some total cost of ownership, simple payback calculations, look at a vehicle on a yearly basis and estimate their emissions, because as a vehicle ages, the air pollutant emissions, you know, there's some deterioration. So you could do something like that with A-Fleet, but again, like the fuel economy stuff, you'd have to enter that into A-Fleet and help, you know, to generate results more specific to your case.
I guess I'll just ask one last question before we end this webinar. I think there's a lot of folks that are thinking through different policies that we're going to be putting in place in order to help decarbonize the transportation system. And so, you know, these models are often being used as tools to help decision-making process, and the policies are also having to be developed on a longer-term time frame. When we consider, for instance, GHGs, and we're looking out to a horizon of 2050, we have to be able to plan the possibility of decarbonizing completely by, or at least close to minus 80% by 2050. So with the results that are currently you know, being showed by the models, how would natural gas versus diesel or other options, whether it be other modes of transportation of freight, whether it be electrification or other technologies or optimization of freight, be considered when looking at what what you guys are showing with natural gas? How should the policymaker approach this with the data that's currently available?
Well, you know, 80% reductions in GHG emissions, if that's the 2050 target, are not going to be achieved with fossil fuels. So, diesel doesn't really play into it, neither does fossil natural gas, if those are the targets.
Yes.
Yeah. So, Joanna, you mentioned this, that freight is really a difficult area to decarbonize, and I think in the U.S. folks are looking, specifically, kind of in the short term, that renewable natural gas is doing pretty well in California. They're incentivizing it. I think, scaling up to run an economy on RNG is, not realistic just due to economics and supply. But, it is a big challenge. And yeah, I echo Don's comments.
Well, I'll thank you on that, and just everyone, so this webinar is recorded and will be made available on our website on YouTube. So it's HEC Énergie, that's the account name. I will send anyways email with the link. And just so you know, we also have two other webinars, one which looks at the decarbonization of the logistics of freight transportation with Alan McKinnon, which is an amazing professor from the University of Kuhn. And this is all free and available. And we've also had a previous webinar with Rosa Dominguez-Faust from the UC Davis that also provided an incredible study on the use of natural gas in the freight transportation and the impacts that that can have. So with that, I thank you very much. And if anyone has specific question, please do write directly to the guest speakers, and their presentation will also be made available. Thank you.